Stand and deliver is a phrase synonymous with those dashing kings of the road, Britain's highwaymen. As Adam Ant famously sang in 1981, I'm the dandy highwayman who you're too scared to mention. I spend my time on looking flash and grabbing your attention. And no highwayman has grabbed the attention of the British public more than Dick Turpin. But exactly who was Dick Turpin, and why is he so famous? Whether it's Adam and the Ants hit, or Richard O'Sullivan's TV series, Noel Fielding's current comedy, or Carry On Dick, with Sid James taking the leading role, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Dick Turpin was Britain's first, or certainly most successful, highwayman. But he was neither, and he wasn't even hanged for highway robbery, nor did he ride a horse 190 miles from London to York in just 15 hours. And he certainly wasn't particularly dashing, or dandy, and certainly not chivalrous either, as you're going to find out. In fact, it was over 100 years after his death before he captured the public imagination and put all the other highwaymen in the shade. Hi, I'm Chris Green, the History Chap, telling stories that bring British history to life. And today I wanted to move away from stories of battles and explore the legend of Britain's most famous highwayman, Dick Turpin. This is both in response to several of you who talked about Carry On Dick in my recent episode about Peter Butterworth, and also as a nod to my dad, who was fascinated by the golden age of coaching in Britain. I hope you enjoy it. There had been a long tradition of robbing travellers on England's highways and byways, but the golden age of England's highwaymen, and a few women too, was in a 100-year period running from the 1660s. Highwaymen were suddenly elevated from thugs preying on the innocent to gentlemen knights of the road, chivalrous, dashing, romantic, friends of the poor, and fighters against injustice. With their ubiquitous cry of stand and deliver, your money or your life, highwaymen have captured the public imagination ever since. John Hind is possibly the earliest highwayman to achieve any sort of notoriety. A royalist soldier during the English Civil War, he took up highway robbery as much as a resistance struggle against Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth as a simple criminal act. Refusing to rob royalist sympathisers and giving much of his earnings to the poor, he achieved a sort of political Robin Hood status. Unfortunately, his role of resistance hero rather than robber rebounded on him, as in 1652 Cromwell had him convicted of treason against the state rather than simple robbery. He was executed by being hanged, drawn and quartered here in Worcester, where I live. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660 ushered in the golden age of highwaymen and the emergence of the gentleman highwayman, none more so than Claude Duval. A minor French noble, he came across to England with the restoration of Charles II. He started robbing coaches, especially on the Great North Road, and built a reputation as a well-mannered robber who didn't use violence. According to legend, he even allowed one victim to keep his purse, in return for letting Duval dance with his wife. Unfortunately, this gentlemanly behaviour did not prevent the law catching up with him. In early January 1670, he was arrested whilst having a drink at the Hole in the Wall tavern in Chandos Street in London's Covent Garden. A current pub in the street, the Marquis, claims to be on the site of this tavern. Found guilty of 6 counts of robbery, he was executed by hanging at Tyburn, which is roughly where modern-day Marble Arch is located in London. He was buried at St Paul's, Covent Garden, where a memorial read, "Here lies Duval. Reader, if male thou art, look to thy purse. If female, to thy heart." Gallant, well-mannered, in his 20s, and a suave Frenchman, he did more than anyone else to create the enigma of the gentleman highwayman. John Nevison was another gentleman highwayman during the Restoration period. Basing himself around Newark-on-Trent in Nottinghamshire, he and his accomplices proceeded to rob travellers, also on the Great North Road, in the 1670s. But his travels took him further afield, and in 1676 he robbed a traveller near Rochester in Kent. In an attempt to cover his tracks, he took a ferry across the Thames, and then reputedly rode north all the way to York, covering the distance in an incredible 15 hours. Upon his arrival in York, he deliberately sought out the Lord Mayor of the city. When the authorities eventually caught up with him, he proceeded to produce the Lord Mayor as his alibi that he had been in York that day, and he was found not guilty. That ride earned him the nickname Swift Nick, supposedly from King Charles II himself. Now, you might have heard of a similar story involving Dick Turpin, and I'll come to that in a little while. But first, let me finish off the side story of John Nevison. Like Claude Duval, he was known as a gentleman highwayman who rarely, if ever, used violence. Whilst he might not have harmed his victims, the same couldn't be said for Darcy Fletcher, a constable sent to arrest him, whom he shot dead. Arrested for that murder, Nevison was eventually hanged at York and buried in an unmarked grave. This idea of the romantic gentleman highwayman caught the public imagination, although I'm not sure how the victims felt. Even after Turpin's time, other highwaymen lived up to the reputation established by Duval and Nevison, such as Jack Rann, known as 16-String Jack, who went to the gallows in the 1770s. With a reputation for bright clothing, he entertained the vast crowd who'd come to watch his execution at Tyburn by dancing a jig and joking with the executioner. His criminal career had made him a short-time celebrity, and he wasn't alone. When James Maclean, made famous with his partner in crime, William Plunkett, was sentenced to death in 1750, it's reputed that 3,000 guests paid to visit him in jail. So yes, the film Plunkett and Maclean, starring Robert Carlyle, is loosely based upon two real highwaymen, as is the 1945 black and white film The Wicked Lady. This production sees Margaret Lockwood playing Lady Catherine Ferrers, a real-life noblewoman from Hertfordshire, who is suspected of being a highwaywoman, once again during the Restoration period. But these characters, and there are plenty more, are all overshadowed by one highwayman above all, Dick Turpin. But who was Dick Turpin, and why did he become so famous? Now, before I go on, if you're enjoying this story, then please give me a like, make a comment, or better still, join my supporters club. Anyway, back to Dick Turpin. Born in the village of Hempstead, Essex, in September 1705, Richard, or Dick, was one of 6 children of Mary and John Turpin, the local butcher and innkeeper. Dick married Elizabeth Millington in 1725 and set up his own butcher's shop in Buckhurst Hill. Now part of the Greater London conurbation, although still officially in the county of Essex, at the time, Buckhurst Hill was a small village bordering Epping Forest. It seems that he got involved with a group of local deer poachers, the so-called Essex Gang, also known as the Gregory Gang, after their leader Samuel Gregory and his 2 brothers. At this time, deer poaching in the area was so rife that it actually resulted in an Act of Parliament being passed against poachers. The Black Act, or Waltham Black Act of 1723, made it an offence punishable by death to blacken your face at night in the vicinity of a forest or park. Turpin, as a butcher, was in an ideal position to fence their poached deer and became an invaluable part of their gang. With the authorities cracking down on poaching, by the end of 1734, the Gregory Gang had begun to focus on a new area of criminal activity: burglary, raiding several homes in the Woodford and Chingford areas. Now, it's worth remembering that many of the haunts of both the Gregory Gang and Turpin in his highway robbery career are now part of London, but at the time were small villages in the surrounding countryside. Apart from jewels and valuables, many homes contained significant amounts of cash, people preferring to keep their eyes on their own money rather than entrusting it to a bank. So homes, especially isolated ones, were prime targets. And the Gregory Gang didn't bother with any finesse. They, including Turpin, were violent thugs. In February 1735, Turpin was with the gang when they raided a home in Loughton. Here, they terrorised an elderly woman and her son, threatening to place her on a fire unless she revealed where her cash was hidden. On another occasion, Turpin personally stripped and then savagely beat an old man with the butt of his pistols. The old man then had boiling water poured over his head before being made to sit, bare-bottomed, on the open fire in the house. If this attack wasn't violent enough, Samuel Gregory then raped the maid. Following yet another brutal raid, this time in the rural area of Marylebone, definitely not a rural area anymore, the Secretary of State, the Duke of Newcastle, offered a reward for information leading to the capture of the Essex or Gregory Gang. In the middle of February, 3 of the gang were arrested whilst drinking at a tavern, and one of them, teenager John Wheeler, agreed to name the rest of the gang in return for immunity from prosecution. Descriptions of the gang still at large were circulated in the London Gazette, and for the first time we get a clear picture of what Turpin looked like. 5 feet 9 inches tall, broad-shouldered, about 26 years of age, who usually wore a blue-grey coat and a natural-coloured wig. His face, broad in the cheekbones but narrowing towards the bottom, was described as very much marked with the effects of smallpox. Smallpox is a disease that we don't have nowadays, but back in 18th century Europe, the period we're talking about, it was the continent's leading cause of death, killing 400,000 people a year. Of those who survived, many were blinded and plenty more were disfigured, just like Richard Turpin of Essex. Hardly the dashing highwayman as he was later portrayed. With young John Wheeler singing like a canary, the net was closing on the gang. Soon after those initial arrests, 3 more members of the gang were captured and put on trial at the Middlesex Assizes in late February 1735. 3 members of the gang were hanged in public at Tyburn the following month. Their bodies were left to rot in gibbets on the side of the nearby Edgware Road. Within a month, all 3 Gregory brothers had been captured, one dying of a gunshot wound in prison, whilst the other 2, including the leader, Samuel Gregory, went to the gallows. In less than 2 months, the notorious Gregory Gang had been smashed. And now Dick Turpin entered a new phase of his life that transformed him from an unknown butcher and gang member into a legend. Dick Turpin, the Highwayman. In many ways, it was an easy and obvious career progression. Epping Forest had long been the haunt of highwaymen, who had used it as a safe refuge to attack rich travellers moving between London and the horse racing at Newmarket, as well as those on the Great North Road. Teaming up with fellow gang survivor Thomas Roden, the 2 carried out their first highway robberies in the Epping area in July 1735. Now with a bounty of £100 on their heads, the 2 men went south of the Thames, and in August were responsible for several highway robberies in Surrey. Later that month they robbed a traveller on Hounslow Heath, close to where Heathrow Airport now stands, and where there is a road called Dick Turpin Way. By December, they were seen in Winchester, Hampshire, which shows just how widely highwaymen were willing to travel in those days. By the end of the year, Turpin suddenly disappears from view, although why is unclear. He resurfaced again in the spring of 1737, operating with 2 new highwaymen, Matthew, also known as Tom King, and Stephen Potter, once more in the area around Epping Forest. On the 30th of April, Turpin and his accomplices robbed Joseph Major outside the Green Man Tavern in Leytonstone. Rebuilt in the 1920s and now part of the O'Neill's chain, at the time the tavern sat on the Great North Road, right on the edge of Epping Forest. Relieving their victim of his horse and £7 to £10 in coins, they rode off, whilst Mr. Major reported the incident to the landlord, Richard Bayes. Bayes seems to have been a good citizen, Sherlock Holmes and publicity seeker in equal parts. He managed to track down the stolen horse to another tavern in Whitechapel, now in the heart of London's East End, but at the time a little way out of the city. King's brother was apprehended when he came to fetch the horse, and led the arresting party, including landlord Bayes, to the highwayman. In the ensuing melee, as the trio tried to avoid arrest, Matthew, or Tom King, was wounded by gunfire and died of his wounds nearly 3 weeks later. There seems to be some confusion as to who actually fired that fatal shot. Bayes wrote his own account of the melee as part of a pamphlet outlining the life of Turpin, which became a minor bestseller. In his account, he claimed that Turpin fired at him, missed, and mortally wounded King instead. Other accounts from witnesses at the scene said this was pure artistic licence by Bayes, and it was actually the landlord who had fired the shot. Whatever the truth, Turpin fled to a small cave in the depths of Epping Forest. But he had not found safety. He was spotted by Thomas Morris, a servant of one of the forest keepers. On the 4th of May, as Morris approached the hideaway armed with a pair of pistols, Turpin opened fire and killed him. Now with a £200 reward on his head for murder, Turpin leapt on his horse Black Bess and rode north towards York. With his pursuers on his tail, Black Bess galloped through the night up the Great North Road. The Great North Road was the main route from London to York and on to Edinburgh since the Middle Ages. It has now morphed into the A1, which follows roughly the same route but tends to bypass the towns along the way that provided food and lodgings for travellers on the old road, places such as Hatfield, Baldock, Stamford, Grantham. Many inns and taverns along the route later claimed to have served Turpin food and drink during his desperate flight. Black Bess completed the 190-mile journey in 15 hours, but there, in sight of the city, the brave horse finally collapsed and died. It's the stuff of legend, and that, unfortunately, is all it is. A great story. There is no contemporary evidence of any pursuit by the authorities, let alone Turpin's epic ride. It was 100 years later that William Ainsworth tells of this epic ride in his book Rookwood, taking the journey of John Swiftnick Nevison from nearly 60 years before and reappropriating it to Turpin. So what really happened to Dick Turpin, and how did he end up swinging from the gallows at York 2 years later? Well, I'm afraid the story of his demise is far more lame, although with an ironic twist that you really couldn't make up. He did indeed move up the Great North Road, but only as far as the county of Lincolnshire, where he ended up living in the market town of Long Sutton for about 9 months, under the alias of John Palmer. When he was accused of sheep stealing, he got out of town before the local constable could arrest him and headed north through the county. There, he took the ferry across the Humber into Yorkshire. Claiming to be a horse dealer, John Palmer settled in a small town just to the west of Hull. In early October 1738, nearly 18 months after shooting Thomas Morris, Turpin was shooting again, although this time it wasn't a person, but a gamecock belonging to another man which he shot in the street. Not a big deal, you might say, and what on earth is a gamecock anyway? Back at this time, the blood sport of cockfighting was all the rage in Britain. It wouldn't be banned until the 1830s. Huge bets were placed on the outcome of these fights. So, if you had a champion gamecock, it was worth a lot of money, rather like a winning racehorse. And thus the owner of this particular rooster was not best pleased and called in the law. Turpin was arrested and taken to the nearby town of Beverley. There, 3 justices of the peace, JPs, inquired as to exactly how John Palmer made his living. He claimed that he was a butcher, which is true of a fashion, who'd fallen on hard times in Long Sutton. Well, that's one way of putting it. and he had moved north to improve his fortune, which again is sort of true, isn't it? The JPs decided to dig a little deeper and contacted their fellow Justice of the Peace down in Long Sutton, Mr. Delamere. Delamere gave a slightly different account as to why Palmer had left his town. And furthermore, he claimed that Palmer was a horse thief, and he had several witness statements to that effect. This accusation raised things to a whole new level for the JPs up in Beverley, because since the reign of Henry VIII, horse stealing was considered a capital offence. In other words, it carried the death penalty. This was out of the JP's league, and so, accused of horse theft, John Palmer, as they still thought him to be, was moved to York Castle to face trial at the York Assizes in early 1739. The only positive news for our highwayman was that the authorities in York were under the impression that they had John Palmer in their custody, and not the notorious highwayman and murderer, Dick Turpin. But that was all about to change, and in an almost comic fashion. Whilst in the county jail, Turpin wrote a letter to his brother-in-law down in Essex. Before the introduction of the penny black postage stamp in 1840, it was actually up to the receiver, not the sender, to pay for postage. And many receivers, especially if the letter had travelled a long distance, like from York to Essex, with the associated cost, refused to do so. And that is exactly what his brother-in-law chose to do. Announcing that he knew no John Palmer in York, he refused to pay. The letter was returned to the post office in nearby Saffron Walden. And now we have that ironic twist of fate. It so happened that the postmaster, one James Smith, had taught fellow school pupil Dick Turpin to write. He recognised the handwriting on the envelope, and it wasn't John Palmer's. He immediately travelled north and identified Turpin to the authorities. Pocketing the £200 reward offered by Secretary of State Duke of Newcastle after the murder of Morris in Epping Forest, the postmaster returned home. With Dick Turpin in custody, the Duke of Newcastle now wanted him brought to London for trial. However, the judge in York successfully argued that it should proceed in York. Now, whether this is a judge showing judicial independence from politicians or simply northern pride, we really don't know. It could also have simply been a matter of prudence. Whilst horse theft, highway robbery and murder all carried the death penalty, the compelling evidence was for the horse theft, so maybe better to hang him for that one than let him be acquitted on the other charges for lack of concrete evidence. The trial of Dick Turpin began on the 22nd of March, 1739. Offering little defence, he was found guilty and sentenced to be executed in public. In 1739, there were 84 recorded public executions in England, 12 for highway robbery. Dick Turpin, without a doubt British history's most notorious and famous highwayman, was not among them. He was one of 8 men executed for horse stealing instead. On the 7th of April 1739, he was taken on a cart to Knavesmire, York's equivalent of Tyburn, for public executions. This is the same location where John Nevison had met his end nearly 50 years before. Along the way, Turpin acted like the gentleman highwayman, bowing to the crowd. But he didn't dance a jig, joke with the executioner, or make a rousing speech to the watching throng. Contrary to modern films, at this time hangings did not involve a prisoner dropping through a trap door, but rather standing on a barrel or a cart, which was then removed and the prisoner died from a slow strangulation. It's called the short drop method of hanging. Turpin climbed the scaffold and stood on a barrel as the noose was tightened around his neck. And then, before the barrel could be removed, he jumped. He was 33 years old. Dick Turpin is reputed to lie in St George's graveyard in York, although as his body was dug up by gravediggers at least once, we cannot be totally sure. Whilst there were pamphlets recording his deeds as a highwayman and the murder of Morris at the time, not least from landlord Richard Bayes, the story of Dick Turpin didn't really catch the public imagination for another 100 years. It was only in 1834, when William Ainsworth wrote his book Rookwood, that he came to the fore. What is amazing is that Turpin was not the main subject of the plot. He appears as a supporting character who flees from justice on Black Bess, covering 190 miles to York in 15 hours. And it was this ride through the night that got readers excited. Suddenly, people couldn't get enough of Dick Turpin. And then, between 1866 and 68, Dick Turpin was the hero serialised in a penny dreadful entitled Black Bess and King of the Road. Now, penny dreadfuls were the Victorian version of a tabloid-style magazine, full of embellished and lurid stories, often focused on crime. Playing very fast and loose with the truth, their version of events was read by millions as the truth. Turpin now became known not just for that non-existent ride to York, but as a gentleman highwayman, chivalrous and champion of the poor. Turpin, the pox-scarred thug, suddenly became a combination of John Nevison, Claude Duval and John Hind, all rolled into one. Indeed, in this Penny Dreadful series, Turpin is the head of a gang of highwaymen, including Tom King, Claude Duval, who'd been dead for 50 years, and Jack Rann, 16-string Jack, who wasn't even born at the time. That Penny Dreadful series helped establish Dick Turpin as Britain's most famous highwayman, and his legend continues right up to this present day. His exploits were captured in the age of silent movies. Richard O'Sullivan starred as Turpin in a TV series in the early 1980s. Even the Carry On team paid homage to him in Carry On Dick, with Sid James starring as Turpin. Speaking of good laughs, Horrible Histories have brought the story to a younger audience with a great song which parodies Adam and the Ants' Stand and Deliver. Check it out on YouTube. Oh, and speaking of Adam and the Ants, did Dick Turpin, or indeed any other highwayman, actually hold up travellers with the immortal lines, "Stand and deliver, your money or your life"? Well, yes they did. Not everyone used those words, and there's no contemporary accounts of Turpin ever using them. But at a trial of a highwayman at the Old Bailey in 1677, the accused was said to have used the term "stand and deliver." 40 years after Turpin's execution, at another trial at the Old Bailey in 1781, John Mawson, giving evidence, says that a bayonet was held to his chest and the attacker demanded, "Your money or your life." So maybe not Turpin's words, and possibly not coined into one sentence like adamant, but both "stand and deliver" and "your money or your life" were lines uttered by some English highwaymen. If nothing else from this story about Dick Turpin, I bet that Adam and the Ant song is now stuck in your head. So there you have it, the dashing, romantic highwayman, Dick Turpin. In reality, a pox-scarred thug and murderer, whose career as a highwayman only lasted about a year, who was arrested for shooting a chicken, who was exposed by a postman, and who was hanged for horse stealing and not highway robbery. It's incredible how legends can evolve, isn't it? Now, if you enjoyed that story and want to learn more about British history, then join me for live exclusive chats and videos in my supporters club. Click on the link below. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.